Good evening, everyone. My name is Janine Audette, and I've had the privilege of working with Matt Malley and Dick Foote in helping them put together this lecture series to open up our 225th plus one celebratory anniversary for the town of Plymouth. We have such a colorful and storied and important history that we wanted to make sure that we shared it with not only the people here, but all members of our community. We are having our videographers from the high school videotape it so that the library will have it for perpetuity. And it is my honor to introduce my friend and a wonderful historian that we are so lucky to have here in Plymouth, Matthew Malley.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's not usually my style to look as though I'm reading my speech. I always gave them off the cuff. But this year, I was asked to give a speech on part of the town's history instead of the whole deal, and I got the beginning, where we came from. So that's much more specific than doing a general history, so I'm going to be forced to depend on reading, and I will announce to you where I have stolen some things to read to you. So we'll start off. Good evening, and welcome to the Historic Lecture Series, which is part of the 225 plus one anniversary celebration. We would like to thank the Plymouth Congregational Church for the use of their building. It was in this building on the 14th of May, 1895, that the town began the celebration of its centennial. Thus, all of us can feel a special connection. We can picture ourselves with people that are long gone, talking about the history that I'm going to speak to you as old news as if it was yesterday in 1895. And we also can picture the town as a group the next day, moving to Terryville. So both sides of town got part of the centennial celebrated in their yard. And that was our plan with this lecture series this year, and I hope we're successful at it. Since the first such celebration of the centennial in 1895, lectures have always been used as a tool to showcase our town's history. In 1895, the keynote speeches were given by Judge Bradstreet, who discussed our manufacturing history, and by a Terryville native who turned out to be a Connecticut Supreme Court Justice, A.H. Fenn. In 1895, A.H. Fenn took sick, but his address was delivered by a Professor R.J. Hibbard of New Britain, Connecticut. The next anniversary after 1895 that we celebrated was 1970. The Da-Dra Squaw Centennial, as Mrs. Klimas always liked to call it, and that was our 175th anniversary. For that anniversary, a lecture series was not delivered, but Francis Ryan was hard at work on updating Mr. Atwater's history of Plymouth, and he would get his work published, and that was the 1970 anniversary's contribution. And then we had, in 1995, the bicentennial year, brought a lecture series on local history. And now, in the 2021, the lectures offered over the next few weeks will hopefully bring our town's history to life for everybody in attendance. The keeping of our history and the sharing of it with all interested parties is a full-time job. Our library and the Historical Society are fortunate to be entrusted with the preservation and caring for of our historical artifacts. You, as interested citizens, are going to have to step up to the plate to keep this going on and keep the valuable work going in the future. I would like at this time to ask you please to observe a moment of silence in honor of a dear friend of mine that was not from town. She married a man from town and came here and immediately took the needs and wants of the towns on many facets to heart. One of her later projects was to write this book, which you will see for Arcadia Publishing, called Plymouth, Connecticut. It's a picture book on the history of the town. And her name was Lanny Johnson. And she was part of the fabric of this town. She was active in many groups, making her an integral part of the weave. And we lost her this year, so a moment of silence for Lanny would be in order. The white schedule that you may have picked up in the hall or not, if you have one at home, you probably didn't. But that was provided to us, compliments of Steve Mandera, who was the chairman of the 1995 bicentennial celebration, and those schedules will still be out there when you leave, so you can pick them up. There's also things about tree walks in town and different tours that you can take to enlighten yourself on the history of our town. Let's see. Okay. The bicentennial celebration was to outline the topics, and then my topic from the beginning will start with our first settlers who arrived well in advance of 1795 and will end with the Revolution. The first people to establish themselves in this area were the Eastern Woodland Indians. This fact is illustrated for us by way of artifacts found in systemic excavations done by the late Gordon Chabot of Myers Road in Plymouth. These excavations yielded artifacts that were almost 7,000 years old. An area surrounding Todd Hollow Brook yielded a soapstone bowl and numerous arrow points that date back over 3,000 years. Artifacts are also collected in fields as they are plowed or otherwise disturbed. These Native Americans lived undisturbed in these lands for thousands of years until new souls from Europe began to arrive and establish themselves. The landing of the Pilgrims was first. By 1634, the white men were in Connecticut, having settled Wethersfield, Windsor, and Hartford. By 1640, some of these settlers moved into Farmington, being the first in the state to go away from navigable waters. Now, in order to set the tone for this early settlement of Plymouth, I wish to read to you from Reverend E.B. Hilliard. And E.B. Hilliard served in this church in the 1890s. His wife, Julia Whittlesey, Julia Whittlesey, sorry about that. Julia Whittlesey Hilliard was one of the pioneers of the Plymouth Library, which closed just a little while ago. And Reverend Hilliard researched what it would have been like to come here. And you need to listen kind of carefully because things change. Plymouth initially was part of Waterbury. And then another section of Waterbury called Westbury broke off. And Westbury and Northbury made Watertown. And it gets very complicated because where the towns were located, which county they were in, could shift. simply because Litchfield County wasn't formed until the late 1750s. So you would have a place like Bethlehem that might be in Fairfield County, or another town that's way far away from Hartford would be in Hartford County. And then as Litchfield got formed, they decided they'd put some of these towns in Litchfield County. It's a horribly confusing matter, which Mr. Outwater outlines for us in grievous detail. And if you were going to be doing research for, let us say, family history or genealogy or probate work, you might find yourself having to go to Woodbury to get probate records that have anything to do with Plymouth. This is one of the questions that was so often asked of me as town historian. Well, where should I go? Well, if I knew that, I'd be a magician. You really have to go, start in Waterbury, see if you get anywhere. If not, start looking in Woodbury and checking things there, and then checking Hartford County, and eventually, if there's a God, you'll find what you need. Now, Mr. Hilliard's essay, The Wilderness and the Indians. Westbury, as a society of Waterbury, as it was known to have been said, was settled in 1677, and at this date, 1739, was in New Haven County, having been transferred to it from Hartford County, where it originally belonged in 1728. Bethlehem was a parish of Woodbury, which was settled in 1673 and belonged to Fairfield County until the organization of Litchfield County in 1751. Judea, now Washington, was formed as part from territory of New Milford, which was settled in 1712 and belonged to New Haven County until, like Woodbury, on the north of this frontier line, at the date of the last named settlement, that of New Milford, in 1712, stretched an unbroken wilderness as absolute as any on the continent at that time. A rough region of rocks and hills and swamps and pathless woods, which were where the white man's foot had never traversed, in which not even the Indians made their abode. DeForest, in his History of the Indians of Connecticut, tells us that the Mohawks, as they made their raids to the Connecticut River, as they used to do in the 17th century, they traversed the whole breadth of Litchfield County without meeting a single human being. The whole region was a wild, lonely, gloomy solitude of nature, that haunt of only wild beasts, and stretching north continuously to the settlements of Canada. It is difficult for us in our day, looking upon the cleared farms, the smiling houses, the thronged and busy towns of Litchfield County, to realize that in the early day there was not a single cleared field, nor smoke from any white man's dwelling. It was called the wilderness, and it made good title on the name. In the patent of Litchfield, given in 1724, the town is bounded, west part on the Shepoag River and part on the wilderness, north by the wilderness. Reverend Benjamin Wadsworth, afterwards president of Harvard College, who accompanied commissioners from the New England colonies to meet the Five Nations of Indians at Albany in 1694, describes the journey as being through a hideous, prowling wilderness. Bears abounded, and fiercer wolves were roving over the mountains and through the woods, and they waked the silence with their howlings. As late as 1747, the town of Goshen voted to pay Timothy Stanley 30 shillings in tenor for killing a wolf. Still later, Jacob Beach in the same town killed 4 wolves in a year, for which he was handsomely received 16 pounds. The same man in another year captured in traps or otherwise, 17 bears. In May of 1783, the General Assembly, declaring, "The town of Harrington being of late greatly infested with wolves, awarded a bounty of 40 shillings to Frederick Phillips of said town for killing a full-grown wolf." Deer were common. In Simsbury, venison was the cheapest food that you could eat. And then we get into, not only were there wild beasts, the only other terror of the wilderness, hostile Indians from Canada came through the forest. And we need to understand, as we see French and Indian War gravestones in our cemetery out here, that the French and Indian Wars the French were already at war with the English. And what they did was engineered Indian attacks out of Canada to further terrorize the English. And we got the French and Indian problem in that fashion. Then, before the settlement of Litchfield, Waterbury was a frontier town. And remember, we were part of Waterbury, and so specially exposed to such savage incursions. Scouts were employed. Sentinels were stationed on elevated places which overlooked the village and the meadows, where men labored during the day. And forts or fortified houses were built as places of refuge in case of attack. April 9, 1700, the town voted to fortify Ensign Stanley's house. And if it should prove troublesome times, and the town see the need, that should they be able to fortify more, should they be able. At the same meeting, the town agreed to vote for building a fort about Ensign Stanley's house, but that the town would go forthwith, and men and boys and teams yet able to work would begin tomorrow. This was surrounded by palisades, which are upright poles with the tops chopped to a point so that people couldn't scale them. And March 15th, 1704, the town agreed to fortify Mr. Southmade's house. They meant to have the minister safe. And February 31st, 1706, the town agreed to build the fort that was left at Lieutenant Standis's, and the ensign has been promoted strong. At the same meeting, it was proposed to build a new fort, June the 23rd, 1707. The town, by vote, considering their troubles and how the enemy do agree to lay aside the cutting of bushes and brush that is on the highways and common pastures of the town, which was warned about repairing, and the town was warned about repairing the forts, and to finish them by Wednesday next at night. Into these fortified houses in time of alarm, all of the people resorted at night, returning again in the morning to their own homes and the labors of the day. Nor did the event prove these anxieties boundless or doubtless. In 1710, a party of Indians killed a man named Holt in the south part of this town on a spur of Mount Toby, which is today's Mount Tobe. And then they went on to go further than that. Another man named Jonathan Scott was having his lunch in the Hancock Meadow with his family, and the Indians captured him and carried him off to Canada. In Woodbury, another frontier town of the time during King Philip's War, a watch was kept from sunset to sunrise. 1/4 of the men were kept under arms every day. The town, an hour before day and an hour before night, the usual time for Indian attacks. And scouts on horseback were also sent into the woods each day, with directions to go only as far as to be able to return by nightfall. Forts were fortified. Houses were erected, as in Waterbury. When later, in 1720, Litchfield came to be settled, it was in turn a frontier town and as such, most exposed to Indian attacks. From 1720 to 1730, 5 houses were surrounded with palisades. One was in the center, one a half a mile south, one on the east side, and the other one on the west, and one at South Farms, now Morris. Soldiers were stationed to guard the inhabitants both while they were at work in the field and while attending public worship on the Sabbath. In May 1722, Captain Jacob Griswold, being at work in a field about a mile west of the center, 2 Indians rushed upon him from the woods and took him, pinioned his arms, and carried him off. During the night following the first day's march, however, he managed to escape with the guns of his captors, with which, keeping them at bay during their pursuit of him the next day, he got back to his family. The next year, Joseph Harris, while at work in the woods, was attacked by a party of Indians, and attempting to escape, they pursued him, and finding they could not overtake him, they shot him in the head and scalped him. This was only 5 years before Henry Cook, the first settler here, built his log cabin up the river and thus founded the Society of Northbury and the region, the town of Plymouth. And as I've sketched the outline of this region, north and west, that we might be better able to realize the conditions under which the new community here was planted and our fathers set up their early homes. It was no child's play. Away up here in the wilderness, amongst wild beasts and wilder savages, away from friends, amid hardships and exposures of every kind, required a degree of courage and fortitude and endurance that we know little of, and for which we should be the more supremely honoring them. At no small price was purchased the inheritance which we so freely enjoy. I hope that I haven't bored you to tears with the reading of that. As I began reading through it, it immediately, the way it was worded and the way it was put together and the way it made its point, reminded me of my mentor in the historical business, Alan Miller. I could see him in front of the 8th grade class in Harry S. Fisher School, dressed up as an Indian and attacking the settlements and doing everything on sight so that we would put it in our minds. And 50 years later, I can still remember it like it was yesterday. My hope is that you will remember hearing things like that many years from now and say to people, you got to pick up on that story about what this place was like before we settled it, that's in Atwater history, and make good use of it. Now, so we've talked about the tremendous idea of trying to get anywhere because of the thickness of the forest and the problems associated with it. And we know that the settlers came from Farmington in 1657 and found what was supposed to be a lead mine. But it took 16 years for those settlers to get from Lead Mine Brook to Waterbury in order to found the town of Waterbury, of which the section of Northbury was part. And as we sit here and think about this, just to think 16 years to break through and get to Waterbury is almost incomprehensible. But that's the school. So they got in the Naugatuck Valley and they found that what they thought was a lead mine, and they applied to the Tungus tribe, who were the owners of the land at the time, for the right to work the lead mine. This was conveyed to the hunters by deed, which is now recorded in another spot, Farmington. And no immediate settlement seems to have resulted from the mine, nor was any wealth garnered from it, so it was abandoned. The settlement of the Naugatuck Valley began downriver at what was first known as Mattatuck and later as Waterbury. We talked about the 16 years, And then we discovered that after being petitioned by the Farmington people, as they put in quotations to petition the Waterbury court, by the Farmington people, they set aside an order to set up a plantation at Mattatuck and appointed a committee to regulate and to order it. Let's see. Articles of association were drawn up and signed by the settlers in June of 1674, and a site for the village was selected. King Philip's War caused a 3-year delay, and in 1677, settlement was begun. The settlers in Waterbury lived close together at first, but by the early 1700s, they were forced by a lack of space to locate away from the town center. Some of the settlers moved north, and here in 1725 to 1730 is where the history of Northbury begins, or Plymouth begins. The first settler was Henry Cook, who lived in what today is Thomaston. The Blakesleys, the Fords, and the Sutliffs were other early families who came here. In all of the early New England towns, Plymouth being no exception, the first moves toward organization were towards church privileges. The first public body was the church. The first public building was the meeting house. And the first public officer was the minister. The earliest history is that of the church. After 4 applications to the town and 5 to the General Assembly, we got what was called winter privileges, and we got Northbury finally added to the list of ecclesiastical societies in Connecticut in 1739. The society was organized, but did not exist yet. The General Assembly, who was in charge of the church, mind you, the General Assembly had built the ship and left it on the stocks. Those who were to sail it alone could launch it, and this they proceeded to do. By November 1739, the society was organized, and by May of 1740, a minister was installed. The years following the founding of the church were at first tumultuous. Debates over which side of the river on which to build the meeting house went on for years. When the dust settled, the meeting house went up on the east side, and it was not this meeting house. Do not confuse yourself. This is the third meeting house to sit on this side, and this one was built in 1838. The years following the founding of the church were at best tumultuous, and we talked about the road, and then we said it was built on the east side of the river, and those on the west side left the church and formed an Episcopal society. The loss of many members weakened the Congregational church. However, it forged ahead. In 1744, the society voted to build. By 1746, no work was done on the meeting house, but a vote was taken to get and draw timbers for it. In September of 1747, a vote was taken to allow Sabbath day houses, which are small cabins around the perimeter of the green, where you could have a little fire and try to warm yourself up in breaks during the hours-long sermons that the Congregational church featured. So the Sabbath day houses were built around the green. And then, let's see, St. Peter's Episcopal Church was organized by 11 families, branching off from the Reverend Mr. Todd's congregation of 18 families in 1740. By 1796, the group was able to build a meeting house, which stood on the corner of Plymouth Green until a furnace fire destroyed it in 1915. The primary occupation of our earliest settlers was farming. The settlers raised enough to feed themselves and to pay the minister. The only businesses noted in any of the plans were grist mills and sawmills. And let's see. And the French and Indian Wars presented some difficulty for our early settlers, and after the Revolution, our industrial heritage would begin to bloom. I would be abandoning my responsibility to all of you were I not to recognize the tireless work done by Janine Audette to bring about these lectures. We as the speakers have the historical facts, but all of the details of delivering them to you and the preservation by the students at the Terryville High School were handled by Janine. May we have a round of applause for her, please. I hope that you enjoyed this lecture. The topic is a tough one because there's so many specifics in the church history of this being passed and that being passed and dates and times and everything else. I feared that I would bore you to tears. So what I tried to do was do a general overview, put a spark in you for town history, which will cause you to return as other speakers handle our industrial past, our military past. We have one program for children at the Terryville Congregational Church, and the last program is going to be stories. They're historically accurate to a point. They're to a bigger point hilarious, and I hope that you'll all come and have a very good time. Thank you very much, and good night. Yes.
I've always wondered about what the bridge was like over the river from here to Thomaston when the town was first established. Was there a bridge? Were they using a ferry? Was it treacherous to get across?
It was very treacherous. There was several different bridges over the years. There was a covered bridge at one point, and that got washed away. There was what they called a cart road on one side of the river because the only vehicles that the early people had was carts. The winter privileges, which the church negotiated with the General Assembly to avoid the tax to pay the minister in the winter, were put in because the people literally had to walk across the river 9 times to get to worship service. So the transportation was minimal. That was why there was such a huge fight over the east and west side of the river for the meeting house, because it involved crossing the river so many times to get to it. And this book, The History of Plymouth by Francis Atwater, if you want to dive into huge detail on these subjects, is something that you need to look at. I mean, it's kind of like reading the minutes of the town meetings from the year 1. He's got them all in here, all the dates, but I just lived in mortal fear that if I sat here and started spitting them out that everybody was going to go to sleep. But in answer to your question, bridges were minimal. You forded the river by walking through it where it wasn't too deep, and you did that 9 times to get to Waterbury to church, and that was the origin of winter privileges. Yes, I will talk you in blue, please.
How did they come up with the name Plymouth?
Plymouth was taken from the Pilgrims. Plymouth, because the people were descended from there. It's never been said the name of Plymouth was come up with by this method, but it's always been said that Plymouth was named after the Pilgrim settlements in Massachusetts. Yes.
The initial families that settled here, what was the reason? Why were they looking for farmland?
Well, they had started out in Waterbury, and Waterbury ran out of space. You got too many people and yes, they were looking for farmland. Their livelihood was agriculture. They came from places like Branford, and it's the only reason that the people from Plymouth, Mass, branched out to Hartford was because of overcrowding. It was always an overcrowding issue and the need to spread out a little bit and get enough room to operate. That was what drove them. Yes, Janine.
Yeah, how did they come up with the 5 boroughs of Plymouth originally, the different districts?
There's a question that's puzzled historians for years. And I'm not going to be able to answer all of it. Some of them came along late, like Lake Plymouth. Started out as Uncle Zach's Pond. It was flooded at one point. Plymouth, they decided that flooding it wasn't the best use of the land. Perhaps they should grow onions up there. Then, when that got over, Plymouth bought it for woodlots for the mill that was down at the bottom of the hill here, for the brass mill. And then, later on, Mr. Visconti got a hold of it and proceeded to develop the Lake Plymouth Boulevard area and the roads that go up the mountain, Hoosier Road and such and so. But it just got its name there. It got its name because of the development. Fall Mountain was always Fall Mountain, but it wasn't the Fall Mountain that we imagined. Fall Mountain was a farming district. There was one family up there by the name of Tolles that owned most of it. They arrived there in 1789, left for the last time in the year 2000, and saved everything that they ever used, including the mail, for posterity. The Historical Society is blessed with many things from the Toll Farm, and also the mail is documented in a book, privately printed, available, I believe, on the reference shelf at the library, called Tough as Tigers, A Family History in Letters. Then we get to Pequabic, which throws us a very interesting curve, because Victorine Cleveland, in her research in order to do the aluminum sign that's in front of the town hall and talks about the town, found out that at one point in its formation, Pequabic was Susanville. Who Susan was, we have not yet discovered. So if anybody has any ideas, God bless you. Plymouth is self-explanatory. That was the mother town, was the mother district. Terryville broke away as the industry started to develop, which you'll hear about in one of our lectures, and it became industrialized and populated. It took over from Plymouth as the center of town, and it just broke off. It's called Terryville. But the Susanville one is the big puzzle that we face. Yes?
You talked a lot about the Indians at first. Were most of them, did any of them integrate into society? Were they all driven out or mostly killed by disease?
I'm not going to say that most of them were integrated into society. I don't know. I think they just left basically on their own, save the Indian Wars. But we had Indians as late as 1895, and I should be saying Native Americans, and please excuse me. We had Native Americans as late as 1895 with Indian Jack living up at Jack's Cave in Fall Mountain. And in Mr. Hilliard's essays, he remembers one Indian whom he names, and whose name I've forgotten, who remembers being able to get game without any effort and complains loudly that the reason that he can't do that anymore is because the white man's gun makes too much noise, and if he got the game with a bow and arrow, other game that was close by wouldn't have any idea there was a problem, and he could get more of it. And he's written up in Mr. Hilliard's essay. All right, well, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope, as I say, that we can see you for future ones. And thank you very much.